Hey, A-Pushers. So welcome to Frame 7 and JFK's Domestic Policy. So let me go ahead and set the stage for you. We were in our previous video talking about JFK and foreign policy, which was basically all about the Cold War and how the Cold War dominated foreign policy in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? I will tell you that that's going to influence domestic policy. So let's start kind of with the Red Scare of the 1950s. And so the Red Scare really did something to both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. It basically gave the Republicans a policy position of being very anti communist and very pro military, very pro superpower. To the Democrats, it actually pushed them, at least politically, to the center because they didn't want to be accused of being pro communist or being pro Russian or being pro dictatorial leadership. They didn't want to be billed as the party of communism. So as a result, what we're going to see politically, anyway, is that the Democrats moved to the center. Now remember, this is before the JFK administration is going to be before the real rise of the hippies. That doesn't happen until the mid 1960s. So remember, we're going all the way back to 1960, right? And the 1960 election. And Kennedy is going to be an interesting pick for the Democratic Party. He is very centrist, as is reflected in this new Democratic Party. However, Kennedy is also a young guy. Going from Eisenhower to Kennedy. Now, granted, they were both in World War II, but in very different roles. Eisenhower was, a graybeard. He was an old guy. He was in leadership. He wasn't in combat. Where Kennedy was um, a young soldier, so to speak. Actually, he was in the Navy, but he was a young guy, in his 20s. So, so Kennedy is truly GI Joe, right? Joe and Rosie. He's GI Joe, whereas Eisenhower was the dad of GI Joe. So, my point being is that we're seeing a generational shift, right? We are going from the old school to now the young. And that is something that is very reflective of the 1960s, where the young eventually are going to turn the 1960s into that social revolution. But it doesn't happen yet in under Kennedy, but he does forge the way, kind of talking about a new frontier, right? In his inaugural, he famously said the torch has been passed to a new generation, right? Going from old school to new school. And his whole political agenda is going to be very centrist, as you're going to see, but he does make it exciting. And that's the thing that I think propelled Kennedy to the national spotlight. He brought a level and a sense of enthusiasm. In his Democratic National Convention speech, in which he accepted the nomination of his party, he basically called for a new frontier, right? Beyond that frontier, and this is a quote from his speech, are uncharted areas of science and space. We're talking about the space race here. Unsolved problems of peace and war. Realize that has ended, but Vietnam is starting to escalate. Unconquered problems of ignorance and prejudice. We'll see that returning World War II African Americans are going to essentially kickstart, right, the civil rights movement. Unanswered questions of poverty and surplus. So we're going to start to see the income gap starting to widen after a decade, the 1950s, in which we see the rise of the middle class. As it evolves, what we're going to see is a widening income gap. It would be easy to shrink from that new frontier, to look to the safe mediocrity of the past, to be lulled by good intentions and high rhetoric, and those who prefer that course should not vote for me or the Democratic Party. So, in this speech, you can see he is bringing a level of hope and enthusiasm to the Democratic Party in a time in which the Democratic Party really needed a kickstart after the popularity of the anti communistic Republicans. All right, so let's get started on that idea. And one of the things that he's going to do, being a centrist, and that's my argument here, is that he is going to try and bridge that gap between the Eisenhower generation and the G.I. Joe generation, right? And so he's also going to start to bring in the idea of Jenny and Forrest, right? So he's going to try and bridge that gap. So listen to these famous words, and perhaps in that light, you'll understand what he was trying to do in this inaugural speech. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So basically, he's saying, hey, hey, boomers, right? Hey, Forrest and Jenny, don't ask what your country can do for you, right? Instead, take on this torch and pass it on and make this country better. And appealing to Joe and Rosie and even the Eisenhower generation, but what you can do for your country. Because as we all know, G.I. Joe and the Eisenhower generation also felt that they sacrificed their lives for the betterment of the country. And then their children, the boomers, are somehow a generation of the me and not the us. All right, so he's trying to bridge that gap, speaking to both audiences. All right, so continuing our idea of centricism. So Kennedy's domestic agenda is called the New Frontier. That's what we're going to call it. Just like FDR was the New Deal and Truman was the Fair Deal, Kennedy's going to be the New Frontier. Again, invoking the ideas of the West and manifest destiny and ideas of rugged individualism. And one of the things that Kennedy wanted to do was to control the economy. There were 2 minor recessions during the Eisenhower administration, so Kennedy wanted to stabilize the economy. So he's going to do this to Republican criticism by controlling business. He tried to work with business and kind of strong-arm business into stabilizing. For example, the steel industry. He sat and spoke to the leaders of the steel industry, both big steel and little steel. And they instituted what is known as a non-inflationary wage agreement, right? A non-inflationary wage agreement. What does that mean? It means that wages would not rise, so businesses didn't have to pay higher wages, but on the flip side, they would also not increase the price of steel. So this is very much control of business by the Kennedy administration. But then steel backed out of the agreement and they raised their prices. So Kennedy, angry, called the representatives of Big and Little Steel into the Oval Office and got them to back down. Republicans will criticize Kennedy for controlling business. All right, Kennedy was also criticized by the Democrats. Like I said, he was very much a centrist. And the Democrats criticized him essentially for his supply side economics. So, remember that the Democrats are changing a bit here. Well, I wouldn't say changing. They're concerned about being billed in the light of the Red Scare. They're afraid of being billed as uber liberal and not particularly fiscally responsible and all that. So Kennedy's going to move to the center here. Instead of embracing Keynesian economics, because Keynesian economics is very much a liberal idea, and of course liberalism is getting a black eye in the light of the Red Scare. So instead, he's going to go with the opposite of Keynesian economics and go with what is known as supply side economics. Reagan will famously employ the supply side economics, often referred to as trickle down or Reaganomics. But it's going to be Kennedy that actually starts it. And the idea. So I know you've heard of supply side. So what is supply side economics? It is an economic theory, and I call it a theory because it has never actually been proven to work one way or the other, because it's never truly been implemented, as you're going to see why. So the idea is that high taxes takes money away from people's pockets. And if money is in people's pockets, then they're going to spend it, stimulating the economy. So we should put more money in people's pockets by lowering taxes. Not only on people, but on businesses. Because if businesses have more money in their pockets, then they'll reinvest in their businesses, and this will stimulate the economy, producing jobs and potentially even increasing wages. Investing in businesses means investing in more factories, more equipment, more research. All right, so supply side, then the hallmark is to cut taxes, right? Both to everyone, including corporations, including the most wealthiest of individuals, because that means more money in the pockets, who will then go and reinvest in the economy. The second part of supply side is once we cut taxes, we also cut government spending, because there will be less money for the government that's going to be in the government treasury. So we got to cut federal spending. And that would mean cutting what many felt were unnecessary programs. Now, this is where the Democrats criticized them, because most of these, quote, unnecessary programs were on social spending, those New Deal, Fair Deal-esque programs. All right, so why does the supply side, I wouldn't say fail to get implemented? And the answer is part B, reduced federal spending. We're not going to reduce federal spending. As a matter of fact, we're going to increase federal spending. Why? Goes back to foreign policy, the Cold War. We're in an arms race and a space race with the Russians. And these arms and space races equal lots of dollars, right? A lot of government spending. And one of the things that's going to propel more government spending is that the Russians beat us, right, to space. So we're all trying to get rockets off the ground. The Russians were able to get it done, and they were able to put the first man in space. Yuri Gagarin was a Russian cosmonaut, and in the Soviet Union's program Vostok 1, on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin entered space and orbited the Earth for 108 minutes. And of course, we all thought, well, the Russians have won. We are all going to die because they're going to win the Cold War. In fact, was not the case. They were not technologically ahead of us. That was not the case. They're just a little more reckless than we are. We have a little more safety precautions in place. And 23 days later, on using the U.S. space program, Freedom 7, Alan Shepard will enter space and orbit the Earth. He will just enter space. And then in Friendship 7, John Glenn will be the first American to successfully orbit the Earth, completing 3 orbits in 1962. So as a result of this, the perception, though, is that the Russians are gaining, the Russians are beating us technologically, so Kennedy has to react. And his reaction is to spend multi-billion dollars on a project that will put a man on the moon. And he made the pledge to invest that in NASA. And it happened. By 1969, 2 U.S. astronauts walked on the moon after spending $24 billion. So there goes supply side economics. All right, let's switch now again, remember, to the center, using supply side. This was a very Republican, conservative economic policy adopted by the Democrat JFK. All right, let's talk to civil rights. Now here again, we're going to see some centricism. JFK can't go radically to the left and completely support civil rights. He can't do that because his win in 1960 was by a very narrow margin. Some people will argue that he didn't win the election, that there was a lot of election fraud associated with the 1960 election. So either way, he won by a very, very narrow margin. So he does not have a mandate one way or the other. And here's the deal. He needs Southern Democrats. Now, y'all remember this. Southern Democrats at the time were racists, right? And so he cannot upset the Southern Democrats to get his new frontier legislation passed. So he had to walk a very fine line here, in order to keep Southern Democrats from becoming Republicans, which, by the way, ultimately they will become. Okay, so the civil rights movement as a whole is launching. Of course, we have Brown versus Board had already been put in place, but that had to do with public institutions, right? Government-run institutions. What about private businesses? And so the lynch counter sit-ins were intended to fight private businesses from stopping segregation. And so the famous were the lunch counter sit-ins. These were restaurants, private businesses that that insisted on segregation or even not serving people of color. So these sit-ins would take place where African Americans would go to these counters and they would just sit there, even though they weren't going to be served because they were sitting in the white sections. They insisted on staying there, civil disobedience, until they were arrested. In addition to the lunch counter sit-ins was the 1961 Freedom Riders. These were movements largely started in colleges up north who would send college-age kids down to the south to continue to work towards desegregation and stopping voter suppression and all of this kind of stuff. So these movements would send buses of these kids down to the south, and then these college kids would start working, to help with the protests, help with the sit-ins, help with voter registration. This was often met by violence, and the most famous example of which is here in Anniston, Alabama, where some freedom riders were stopping at a rest area when their bus was attacked and burned by white supremacists. Kennedy did react simply by sending federal marshals to protect the freedom riders, something that Eisenhower also did, sending federal marshals down to protect. Didn't necessarily endorse any of these, but did protect. Same thing here in Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was part of the Freedom Ride movement, but Freedom Summer was a movement in 1964 to specifically register African Americans to vote in areas where there was significant voter depression. And of course, ground zero is going to be Alabama and Mississippi. Well, there was one incident during Freedom Summer in which one African American and two white kids who were part of the Freedom Rider movement, part of the civil rights workers, disappeared in Mississippi. Their bodies later were found buried in an earthen dam. And it was the FBI came in to kind of investigate because the local authorities would not prosecute. So the federal government stepped in and found that the police and the KKK were the perpetrators of these horrific murders. The FBI arrested 21 white Mississippians, including the sheriff, but an all-white jury refused to convict any of them. All right. Let's move now to integration of Southern universities and the desegregation of the South. So the North was slowly desegregating, very slowly. South often refused to desegregate despite Supreme Court order. And this is going to continue through the 1960s and into the 1970s. So a lot of protests were taking place in public institutions, particularly Southern universities. Let's go to the most famous of which is University of Mississippi, or Ole Miss. And they've been making news lately, right, about taking down some statues, Confederate-era statues from campus. So in 1962, James Meredith, an African American, decided that he was going to go ahead and register as a student at the University of Mississippi, which of course he was not allowed to because University of Mississippi was all white. No African Americans were allowed. So with this, campus erupts in violence, and Kennedy's going to do again what Eisenhower did, and that is send federal marshals to protect James Meredith and those others who had attempted to enroll African Americans who attempted to enroll in Ole Miss. 1963, we're progressing here to the next year. 1963, Martin Luther King, who rose to national prominence because of Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, is going to lead a desegregation protest in Birmingham, Alabama, considered to be one of the most segregated cities in the United States. Half the population of Birmingham was African American, but only 50% of voters were African American. So there was truly voter suppression happening here. So he led a protest in Birmingham in which people were arrested. As you can kind of see here, police often used brutal tactics to suppress peaceful protesters, including fire hoses, electric cattle prods, and police dogs, not unlike what we've been seeing in recent weeks with regard to George Floyd and the protests over police brutality. And so the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, was very much in favor of segregation. As a matter of fact, he will be running for president in the next few years on the campaign slogan, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And he's going to crack down on these protesters. But that was the point. Martin Luther King, of course, is going to be arrested amongst the protesters and will write a letter from a Birmingham jail. And basically it was to call out other African American preachers to say, hey, you need to join the cause, peaceful protest. And part of MLK's strategy was indeed to demonstrate on television the attacks on peaceful protesters to raise sympathy for the movement, and it worked. The entire world saw these attacks on nightly television, seeing images such as these. All right, Kennedy will respond, like I said, to by bringing in federal marshals. Alrighty, so back in New Orleans, y'all have heard of Ruby Bridges. Same thing was happening here. All right, continuing violence in the South. Very outspoken political protesters and political leaders like Medgar Evers are going to be attacked and assassinated. Medgar Evers was a civil rights worker, and in June 1963, he was shot in his driveway in the back, right, by white supremacists. There was also bombings that were taking place in Baptist all-black churches in Birmingham, killing famously four African-American girls, little baby girls. And of course, in 1963, there was a March on Washington, again organized by MLK. Because stuck in the Congress, stuck in the House and the Senate, was what will become the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the March on Washington was a message to congressmen and senators to vote yay on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And of course, he famously gave his "I have a dream" that my four little girls, or my four little children, will one day live in a nation where there will be not judged by the color of their skin, but in the content of their character. All right, so famous images from the March on Washington, the 1963 March on Washington. And in the midst of all of this, Kennedy will be assassinated. 1963, in November, he's shot while riding in an open limousine in Dallas, Texas. The perpetrator was a lone assassin, indeed, Lee Harvey Oswald. Will be captured soon after Kennedy's assassination in a movie theater. After he was arrested, brought to prison, but then was going to go to his arraignment, where he stands before a judge to be able to see if the arrest was indeed lawful. While he was being transported, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby, allegedly to avenge Kennedy's death. But they caught Jack Ruby, and Jack Ruby was then, interestingly, killed in prison. So conspiracy theories have gone out. And because of these conspiracy theories, there was so much of the conspiracy theories that the Chief Justice, Justice Earl Warren, is going to head up an investigative committee to look into the assassination of Kennedy. Was Lee Harvey Oswald indeed a lone assassin, or was this some sort of conspiracy to take out the president by some Russian organization? Was Jack Ruby working for the Russians? So there was 26 volumes of the study, huge study that was done, of the two murders, both of Oswald and of JFK. And the results were inconclusive. It actually created more questions than it answered. And as a result of the Warren Commission, conspiracy theories will continue to be inflamed. Regardless, Lyndon Johnson, the VP, is going to be sworn in on a plane in Dallas before leaving with Kennedy's body for D.C. And so LBJ is going to be president now. All right, guys, that ends this one, and we will move on to LBJ's administration next PowerPoint. See ya.